Hey, this is Ari. Welcome back to the show. I am very excited to introduce you to today's guest. Her name is Dr. Bonnie Kaplan, and she is a research scientist. She's a PhD. She's a professor emeritus in the Cummings School of Medicine at the University of Calgary in Canada. And she has published widely on the biological basis of developmental disorders and mental health, particularly the contribution of nutrition to mental health problems, poor nutrition to mental health problems, and good nutrition to resolving mental health problems. And she's also the author, with her co-author, Professor Julia Ruckledge, of the book, The Better Brain, which I highly recommend. And that's going to be what we're talking about in this episode. So this is a wonderful episode, great, very, very important content, and for a very important topic that is affecting so many hundreds of millions of people, particularly in the Western world. It really is an epidemic as far as how poor nutrition is creating brain health and psychological health, mental health problems. So I'm really grateful for her work and shedding light in this area. And she's also just a lovely, brilliant person. So I hope you enjoy this episode and get a lot of value from it. So welcome to the show, Dr. Kaplan. Such a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
So let's talk big picture first. I read your book. I'm a big fan of your book. I really loved it. And it's an area I'm also particularly passionate about, and I feel doesn't get the attention it deserves. I spent 2 years in medical school with the idea that I would eventually become a psychiatrist, and then got very disillusioned with that. I left medical school. I went to a PhD program in clinical psychology. I completed all 3 years of my coursework for that PhD program, and then also became largely disillusioned with that. And, you know, there's an interesting thing that goes on in psychiatry and psychology. Psychiatry tends to reduce everything about mental illness down to a chemical imbalance that we can address with a drug. And then in psychology, everything is thought of as sort of purely psychological, purely cognitive, and the problems are psychological, and they need to be addressed with psychological, psychotherapeutic, talk therapy type solutions. And one thing that was glaringly obvious to me was, as someone who had studied nutrition for a very long time, and health science more broadly, and exercise science and lifestyle medicine, holistic health, is there's this entire body of evidence around things like nutrition and supplementation and sleep and exercise, that we have research linking to mental health and even in the treatment of some of these conditions. And what was remarkable to me is that body of scientific evidence just wasn't being integrated into either psychiatry or psychology. And I'm wondering if you just have any thoughts, like big picture thoughts on sort of that whole landscape.
Did you see the Dilbert cartoon today?
No, I didn't.
I don't have it in this room, unfortunately. It speaks to where the money is. I didn't know that about your background, Ari. I mean, it's people like you who I would love to entice you to become interested in this field, because if you really read the whole book, you saw that there is a vast amount of research, not just linking nutrition and mental health, but proving with longitudinal prospective studies that you can predict risk for the emergence of mental health problems based on what people are consuming. And there's also all the studies that have been done showing that if you forget looking for, I know this is not exactly what you asked me, but I think it's a relevant point. We've lost so many years by people looking for magic bullets. People thinking there's a silver bullet out there. Oh, it must be vitamin D. Let's give people vitamin D and everything will just be fine. Or then it was omega-3s and everything will be fine. And all the big funding agencies throw millions and millions of dollars at these individual nutrients. And I published an article, you're probably familiar with Psych Bulletin. I can send it to you if you want. It's 2007. We reviewed all the studies from the 1920s up to the year 2000. They were all magic bullet studies, and each one said, a few people got a little better. Gee, there's a hint here. So then along came the people who didn't have built into them this idea that you can only change one variable at a time, and instead said, let's give the brain everything it needs, which is the full complement of roughly 30 minerals and vitamins, plus, of course, omega-3 fatty acids. But even they can't, none of us can figure out what phytonutrients to give yet, because there are thousands and thousands of them, and we don't know what they do. But anyway, forget the magic bullet approach. And now we have a body of literature of over 40 studies, all peer reviewed, every manner of symptom, but it's a theme, which I'll go back to if you want me to. And this, and we've shown that you can actually treat mental health disorders. And it's still not magic, there's no study that has found 100% response rate, so there's no magic out there. But it is a powerful tool that should be in the toolbox. And now coming back to what you really asked me, why isn't it? It all comes back to money.
Mm-hmm.
And Big Pharma has money, and there's no money to be had from minerals and vitamins. You can't make money. You can't patent them. You can, but there's no point, because it's very easy to violate a patent. So, it's a sad commentary on humanity, if you want to get really big.
Yeah. I hear, growing up, I've actually been studying health science since I was a little kid, since I was 12, 13 years old. It's over 26 years now. And I remember hearing things of that nature a long time ago, two decades ago, of people saying, oh, it's where the money is. But I didn't really get that until these last couple years. I didn't really get the importance of what that really means. And I also want to comment on what you said about the one thing. This is something that I've talked about over the years. There's in general, not just in this field, but across the board, there is this kind of human psychological tendency to try to look for the one thing that is the cause, quote unquote, of this particular condition. Mm-hmm. And also the one thing that's the cure, and it's amazing how how poor the track record is of that kind of thinking. And yet everybody continues to do it as though it has a really good track record. And, the other thing that you said is, they do all these studies, these magic pill, magic bullet sorts of studies on vitamin D or omega-3s, or is it vitamin C or whatever. Right. And most of those studies, as you said, show minimal results. There's always
a little.
Right. Not only in this field, though, but sort of across the board in every aspect of health. Like, let's say you do a study on vitamin C and cardiovascular disease. Does vitamin C reverse atherosclerosis? Does it reverse neurological disease? Does it cure cancer, right? And you will find that it does not. It does not perform particularly well in any of those particular things when studied in that way as a solo intervention. But and the consequence, this is something you didn't mention, though I'm sure you agree with, the consequence of that is that then the people within conventional medicine get to point to each one of those individual studies and say, you see, it doesn't work. And you see that those studies on vitamin C didn't do anything, and the studies on vitamin D didn't cure the depression, and the omega-3s didn't cure the atherosclerosis, and therefore none of those things work. It's all quackery, right?
Mm-hmm. I know, it's very frustrating.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you mentioned track record. Actually, the track record issue is an interesting one, because it has been an obstacle in mental health, because when vitamins were first being defined, and then as 18th, 19th, early part of the 20th century, that's when they were finding magic bullets. I mean, if you want to get rid of scurvy or prevent scurvy, a very small amount of vitamin C every day is what you need. And so I think that we inherited that mentality with vitamins and minerals in particular, that there would be just a single nutrient. And it's really led us astray. So now you also touched on, and when you were speaking there, you're right, we're very much on the same page. You touched on something that I've been thinking a lot about lately, and I've been saying it to some very large audiences just the other day, actually, to over 600 people, and I saw a lot of heads nodding. It was an actual in-person event, largest one I've had since the beginning of the pandemic. But I said, I've been thinking about what happens to us when we need help with, say, a broken bone, or we go to our doctor because our chronic asthma is acting up, or we have a chronic problem with arthritis. When we go to get medical care in the Western world with any of those kinds of problems, we go in with the assumption, and perfectly valid assumption, that the treatment recommended will be based upon the whole evidence base, and that the people who are treating us will know all the different ins and outs and are saying, even if it's cancer, saying this is what we think you should be treated with based on our view of everything. And that is not true for brain health. When we go in for help with mental health or dementia, we can be damn sure that the recommendations will be based only on pharmaceutical products. And we should be rather outraged at that.
Yeah.
I had a father email me, actually, I turned this into a slide, I'll use it one day, email me about 3 weeks ago about his daughter who, I didn't even remember the result, it doesn't matter, but he asked me some questions, and he was concerned about her, and I said, well, you should look into the nutrition thing, and here's where you can look into clinicians, so I don't do that online or offline. And he read our book and he emailed me back outraged. He said, I have every right to expect that the medical personnel that I go to see about my daughter would be educating me about this. And they didn't.
Yeah.
And I thought, I had never thought of it from that point of view before.
I have a bit of an insider's perspective here because of what I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast. I did the first 2 years of medical school, which is the first 2 years is medical school curriculum. It's where they take their courses. The second 2 years is rounds of different specialties in the hospital. And then I was in a PhD program in clinical psychology. I can tell you, medical doctors learn basically zero. They learn virtually nothing about nutrition. They learn virtually nothing about lifestyle or exercise or circadian rhythm and sleep and stress. Almost nothing.
Nothing.
I mean, we're talking the equivalent of a few hours. I mean, the equivalent, like I knew more about nutrition when I was 14 years old than most MDs know about nutrition, because they don't receive any education in it. And in clinical psychology, they similarly don't receive any education on nutrition or lifestyle. And, we know these things are hugely related to mental health. And that's okay. Not everybody needs to be educated in everything. But the problem is that we have a general public that looks to those people and assumes they do have knowledge of that field of evidence. And it's so far from reality. It's absurd. And then it's further amplified by the fact that many MDs don't even know there is knowledge outside of their domain of what they're educated in. I mean, they assume that they're educated in everything that there is to know, So they have then a default assumption that if there's somebody saying something that they weren't educated in, oh, it must be pseudoscience because I didn't learn about that.
Yes, the assumption is that it's flaky. So actually, I want to tell you a story, if I may. It's in a book, but it's also, we published this one. It's about a boy named Andrew, or we called him Andrew. That's not his real name. And he was an amazing case because he was in a tertiary care pediatric hospital with childhood psychosis at the age of 10. That's pretty serious. And he went through all kinds of clinical trials for 6 months, and the best psychiatrists could not figure out how to get him well. And they sent him home. And I could be more dramatic and tell you about his hallucinations, delusions, etc. They were quite remarkable. And they sent him home. His mother had to quit her job to be taking care of him. He was quite psychotic. And the family had heard, this was in the very early days of when some of the broad spectrum formulas were being developed, but they had heard about one of them and they wanted to try him on it. Well, they were now in an outpatient clinic and they were scared that the outpatient psychiatrist would consider them, flaky, right? So they called me. They knew I had published in this area and asked if I would go with them to the psychiatrist's appointment. We tell the story of what happened to that psychiatrist. This boy became well with no hallucinations or delusions over the course of taking the micronutrients. But here's the interesting part that I want to say to you, given that what we're talking about. He was such a dramatic case. He was known in that hospital as being the sickest child they had ever seen on inpatients unit. And so the psychiatrist and I went and presented him at Grand Rounds for developmental psychiatry. And there was a real, oh, wow reaction. Everybody knew who this was, even though we didn't name him. They recognized him. They knew how sick he'd been. They were very impressed. And the psychiatrist, who was a fairly junior psychiatrist, because the department had never has time to go to rounds, right, had introduced us, was walking me out of the room at the end of the Q&A. And I said, so Dr. So-and-so, you have other children on your unit. Would you like to explore the use of this? And he said, no. And do you know why?
Why?
He said, no, because it's not part of clinical practice guidelines. Right. And so one of the things we do is we educate people in our book about clinical practice guidelines and how they are infiltrated by pharmaceutical money. Mm-hmm. And the former head of the DSM-4 has published on this also. And so nutrition will never be in clinical practice guidelines.
Aye, aye.
So that's how money influences how our children are treated. That's very upsetting.
Yeah, it's very heavy. Okay, so, one thing you wrote in your book was how in Western countries, mood and anxiety disorders have increased dramatically over the last few decades. Right. What popped into my head to ask you in relationship to that is Steven Pinker's work. I don't know if you're familiar with it at all, but one of the things that he argues is that it's very optimistic take. It's like everything is better, right now than at any point in human history. Things are better than ever. I'm wondering if you could kind of explain that apparent paradox of how somebody could argue things are better than ever, yet how we could have more happiness and mood disorders, more depression and anxiety than ever before.
So I don't recall. He mostly focuses on things like war and stuff like that. But his wife is a psychologist, so I'm going to have to look into that, whether he has written on mental health. But I mean, the answer is why things are worse. For a long time, I heard things like, well, life is tougher now. Well, my ancestors had World War II, World War I. In between the Depression, they had the Holocaust, they had the stock market crash, they had the Dust Bowl, they had a lot of problems, but they were eating real food and they had better resilience. So it's a very simple answer to your question, and you can already tell that I can go on and give you a lot of details, but the simple answer to your question is I think our resilience is what is very, very feeble. And all you need to do is look at do you want some of the prevalence numbers? You want your audience to know this?
Yeah, please.
That's so when I was a kid, which is ancient times now, like in the 1950s and 60s, the rate of mental disorders was 1% or less. And now it's 20%, according to the World Health Organization. Now, for a long time, I would say until 10 years ago, as the prevalence rate was zooming up, in light of this was the period of the psychopharmacology revolution. Some people would say it's partly caused by that, but I'm not going to go there. But why was it zooming up? And there were essays written in every psychiatry journal, I think, saying, well, it's just because more people are speaking up and saying they need help. Of course, we want people to feel comfortable coming forward. And they were also saying things like they're just more educated, excuse me, about this not being the best way to live, that there might be a better way to live. So they're coming forward. I don't see those essays anymore. And I read a lot of psychiatry journal abstracts anyway. Often I don't see anybody saying that anymore. I think everyone is pretty convinced that the increase in prevalence is real. And now I'm going to end this with the worst number of all. That 20% sounds high, especially in just one lifetime, but it's only a point in time. It's called point prevalence.
Mm.
If you look at lifetime prevalence and ask, well, what's the probability for any given individual that sometime in their lifetime they will be diagnosed with a mental disorder? It is 50%.
Whoa.
And that's also the World Health Organization numbers. And that number is like a sucker punch. That is, something is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
That can't be normal, that half of us are mentally ill. That's a lack of resilience.
Yeah.
We need I mean, everybody knows that nutrition is the foundation of our mental and physical resilience. That's why we have the World Food Program and kitchens and everything helping people who are in need. They have to have food. So we know it, and we somehow let our kids and ourselves eat ultra processed chemicals without any food in them.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that nutrition is responsible for, would you say, the majority of mental health issues that we have today? Or how would you sort of rank the magnitude of that as a contributor to the mental health epidemic? And then what would you say are some of the other maybe top two, top three, top five things?
Hmm. You know, you can guess, Ari, that I get asked that question a lot, and you may not like the way I'm going to answer it because it's a non-answer, and yet I think it's a more informed way to look at it. Nutrition foundation. It is the fundamental way that we build and maintain our cells. Everything else comes on top of that. And I'll even illustrate it with an anecdote that I hear this a lot from people who say, I was taught, cognitive behavior therapy or this or that or whatever, but not until I fixed my diet could I utilize the information I had been given.
Mm.
So, in a situation like that, would I say that nutrition's more important than CBT? No, I have enormous respect for all of meditation, psychotherapy, all the kinds of exercise, all the lifestyle issues. But if you're not first optimizing your brain function, you're cheating yourself. Does
Mhm.
that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. When
Mhm.
you said resilience a minute ago, do you conceptualize that largely as the result of good nutrition, or is resilience the result of other things as well?
Well, you don't ask me to rank things anymore. You now know I'm not going to do it. So I will simply acknowledge grief. You can have all the best nutrition in the world, but if you have uh, drug addiction, abuse, family violence, I mean, you've got a lot to be resilient to.
Hmm.
And so, of course, everything about my husband sometimes says I'm not a real psychologist, and I'm not. I've never, I always say I've never helped people. I just study them. I've been fortunate to study something that helps. At any rate, I acknowledge the importance of psychosocial factors. I know how important they are. But again, you can't utilize those things unless you're able to sleep well, which we know is affected by our nutrient intake. And if you can't self regulate your emotions, which is the primary, most thematic change we see in people who improve their nutrition, that kind of self regulation. So think of it as the foundation, okay?
Hmm. You said in the book that the right nutritional approach could cut society's mental health care budget by 90%.
Mm,
So, is it accurate to say that most of these mental health issues are coming from poor nutrition in that, if that's the case?
mm. No, I think that there's a little leap in your logic there.
Okay.
So the percent was based on some cases that we studied, and we brought health economists in to evaluate the cost of their mental health treatment. Well, one was that boy I was telling you about, Andrew, a health economist pulled the cost of treating him as an inpatient for 6 months, and then the cost of treating him as an outpatient with micronutrients in the immediate following 6 months, even though it took longer than 6 months for his hallucinations to go away completely. He had improved a great deal. And that was, 97% savings of our healthcare budget. So, and we published another woman who had lived in 3 different provinces, and we had data on over 10 years. And again, it was over 90% savings. So, but we don't have enough of that information yet. We also know, though, from one of the Australian studies, people who change the way they eat actually can save like 20% food budget by eating instead of ultra processed chemicals.
Hmm.
And everyone's shocked at that. Well, I eat from the vending machine because it's cheaper than eating real food. No, no. And I'm not even going to count the cost to your health, but it's only cheaper in that moment. You're only putting in like $1.50 or something, and you can't spend that in a grocery store. But if you add up what you're spending for a week, you will save money if you learn to cook with whole foods.
Hmm.
Sorry,
Got it.
that was a little beyond what you were asking in terms of healthcare costs, but it's a cost. It's very relevant.
Yeah, it's a great answer. Um,
Mm.
to play devil's advocate, let's say someone has anxiety disorder, depression, ADHD, um, schizophrenia, something like that. Well, maybe not. We'll leave schizophrenia out of this for now. But why not just use conventional approaches? Why not just put them on some meds and send them to psychotherapy? What is the big difference between someone doing that versus doing what you're advocating?
We have a wonderful quote early on in the book from Autumn Stringham. I don't know if you noticed that.
Hmm.
She had a postpartum psychosis and was on 5 psychiatric medications and getting the best psychiatry care that we had in our province. And she said, on psychiatric meds, I got better, but on nutrients, I got normal.
Ah.
And we hear that a lot. People feel, of course, there are no side effects. We've been studying side effects for 25 years, published all kinds of data on everything from serum levels and serum markers and heart rate and blood pressure and stomach aches and headaches. And every single study has always found that vitamins and minerals don't cause the adverse effects that psychiatric meds do in most people. Now, having said that, I know a couple of people who report having no adverse effects from a medication, a psych medication, and they feel it helps them. So I say, don't rock the boat. Take it.
Mhm.
What's wrong with that? Sorry, did that answer your question?
It did, yeah. There was a study that came out maybe a week or two ago that I remember seeing. I'm sure you must have seen it. It was talking about how antidepressants were shown not to improve long-term measures of quality of life. Did you see that study?
Uh, I've actually seen more than one. There are a
Mhm.
lot of negative studies coming out on psych meds now, and um, I don't feel that it's necessary to be negative about psych meds in order to get people excited about looking at their nutrition. And I worry about people feeling guilty about having put their kids on psych meds because they didn't know what else to do, and
Mhm.
or people who've been on psych meds for a long time. I don't want anyone to feel guilty about that. There
Mhm.
may be a better way for you, or maybe not, and maybe, you shouldn't feel guilty.
Yeah.
But yeah, quality of life, I mean, you should read some of Don Reed's work if you want to read, and it is READ. He has documented so clearly the adverse events from psychiatric medication across all ages. I mean, one of the things that is never talked about is the number of men, young men, who become impotent, and it's irreversible, even when they go off of their psych meds. These are just, these are very powerful medications, and they're not understood.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about some of the mechanisms, the physiological mechanisms that link nutrition to mental health and brain health. What's going on here? I know that there's obviously a gut-brain axis. Some of these nutrients serve as precursors for neurotransmitters, but how would you sort of go about explaining all of the many different mechanisms going on there?
Sure, I'm going to give you a quiz first. You took biochemistry somewhere along the way, right?
Sure.
So did you learn what a cofactor was?
Yeah.
Do you remember?
Oh,
Yeah,
a nutrient that is necessary in adequate amounts for a certain enzymatic process to take place.
exactly. And the speed of that enzymatic process is measured by Micheli's constant. You might remember that. We
Yeah.
didn't even put that in the book. You don't need to know that kind of level of difficulty.
I'm
But if
glad
I
I
had
got
my,
the I'm glad I got the quiz right, because now I don't have to edit this part out. If you
oh,
didn't embarrass me.
I would never intentionally embarrass you, but you can see why, given what you just said, though, Ari, you can see why I would like the concept of cofactors to be taught starting in about the 6th grade,
Mhm.
because kids can understand it, and then they understand the first and the most direct way in which nutrients are important for them, which is their brains don't work without them, because what is going on in your brain? It's metabolism, fancy word just to mean transformation of one chemical to another. And the way those things happen in human physiology is enzymes, and enzymes don't work at an optimal speed unless they have a sufficient number of cofactors present. So when I was taught as a child, oh, you must, eat a, we used to call it a balanced diet. God knows what it was back then. But anyway, a balanced diet in order to have strong muscles, bones. That's all they said. And I have nothing against muscles and bones, but I didn't know that it's the brain that sucks up disproportionately way more of the factors than any other body part. And so when we're eating, I want children to learn that every bite of food that goes in is either feeding their brain metabolism because of the role of cofactors or not. Now, it doesn't stop there, though. And you very rightfully pointed out that it's a kind of a broad way in which micronutrients, meaning minerals and vitamins in this case, are important for us. Omega-3 fatty acids are so critical to our cell. We are fat heads. 2/3 of our brain is fat.
Mhm.
And if you're not eating it, then you're going to be filling in your cell walls with a whole lot of omega-6s, and that's what you get in those terribly over-processed packages of chemicals that you buy in the grocery store or any convenience store. So you need to change that balance and get more omega-3s to have very efficient and competent cell walls in your neurons. And it doesn't stop there. I'll list 2 more things, okay? One more thing is kids do learn what mitochondria are, that they're the little energy factories in our cells. And they are in every cell in your brain and your body. And every single cell has at least one. Some cells have dozens. And they have one job, and that is to give us the energy that we need for everything that we're doing and for all of our organs. And the way they do that is by producing ATP, which is our energy molecule. What do you need for the metabolic steps to produce ATP? You need minerals and vitamins. So every cell in your body and your energy level and the efficiency of every one of your organs is dependent upon nutrients coming in all the time.
Mhm.
And the last one you mentioned, and that has to do with, our society just loves these kind of trendy things, right? Functional medicine people have been talking about leaky gut and the gut microbiome for over 2 decades, probably 3 decades, but it's caught on now, and it's going to be, this is how you have to relate everything to the microbiome. Well, I don't really disagree with that. I mean, the reality is that our microbiome is absolutely critical. There are, I like to say it's smarter than us, because we humans cannot synthesize any vitamins or minerals. And the microbiome can't synthesize minerals either. We have to get those from a healthy soil. And that's another story if you read that chapter on the soil microbiome. But if you have a gut, some of those good gut bugs are going to be producing small amounts of some B vitamins. But you and I don't know how to do it. Our guts know how to do it. So if your gut is working well and you're absorbing the nutrients from a healthy diet, then that helps get those nutrients up to the brain, and it all works together. Mm-hmm. So better stop. I can go on and on mechanisms, but those are the ones that I think are the most important to know about.
Okay. As far as nutrition and supplementation approach for specific psychological health problems, like let's say a distinction between ADHD versus anxiety versus depression versus autism, do you have big differences in how you would approach those things nutritionally or in terms of supplementation?
Keeping in mind that I am not a clinician and never was, I'll answer your question in terms of the research. Remember early on, I said that there's a theme, and it doesn't matter. I always say that God didn't create our brains with a DSM hand, if God has a hand, okay? And so we don't have a little box for depression and a little box somewhere else for anxiety, etc. And so we notice in our studies, if we recruit people with, say, ADHD, parents come back and report improvements in all kinds of other things. The child is sleeping better, the child is feeling better, there's more energy, they're less constipated, any number of different things. And that's what you would expect with nutrition, is that you get across the board healthy brain. So what have the studies shown? Our book came out before the latest ADHD clinical trial, which is a really important one, the MADI trial, Micronutrients in ADD Youth. So I'm including that in my answer, even though it's not in our book. Excuse me. In all of those studies, it is mood regulation that is the most amenable to treatment and the easiest to treat broad spectrum micronutrient formula. Where do you get irritability? Well, you get irritability with ADHD, you get it with depression, you get it with anxiety, you get it with, what have I left out? Spectrum disorder, I mean, it's a transdiagnostic. Many of these symptoms are transdiagnostic. That's why people end up with some of their diagnoses in their lifetimes. They don't fit into a neat little box. So it's basically, if you have concerns about your brain health in general, it just makes sense to feed your brain an array of micronutrients and omega-3 fatty acids.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk to me a bit about neurotransmitters and what are some of the biggest issues with neurotransmitters that you see as relating to this mental health story? And then secondary to that, can you talk a bit about how nutrition relates to neurotransmitter optimization?
Sure, in a way that I have, but I didn't use the words that would enable you to know that I had. So some of this is a little bit redundant. In chapter 2 of our book, we convinced our editors that even though this is for the general public, we really could have one little diagram showing some brain metabolism. So it's a tiny little piece of the tryptophan to serotonin metabolism. Tryptophan is an amino acid, which is a precursor to serotonin. Now, everybody knows that serotonin is a good neurotransmitter to have. It is believed that that's why some medications called SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, are helpful because it leaves more serotonin in the synaptic cleft. Well, what the micronutrients do is much more fundamental. It enables your brain to do what it's supposed to do, which is to synthesize more serotonin. How does it do it? Because if you're giving your brain a whole bunch of micronutrients at all times, and actually, I want to say something about time, then there will be plenty of cofactors on board, and you will be optimizing your production of serotonin. And in that tiny little diagram that we have in chapter 2, I've forgotten now, but I think there were about 12 micronutrients to make that happen. So it really illustrates why one nutrient, I mean, your next door neighbor may say, oh, I think you should take vitamin B6. I hear it's really good for the brain. And I agree, it's really good. Okay. But why would you take just one? We have evolved to need them all and in balance.
Mm-hmm.
I made a note here to say something about times. I want to give you a little factoid that a lot of people find this is something that they remember and can kind of grab onto. I mentioned that our brain is the greediest organ. And so the one way to look at this is that there is roughly 5 or 6 liters of blood going through in us at any given time as adults now, okay? And our brain is only 2% of our body weight. And so you would think that 2% of the blood would be up in our brain at any given time, but you would be wrong. It's at least 10 times that amount.
Wow.
Our brain vasculature is incredibly, incredibly complex. And so it is sucking up way more of the micronutrients than any other organ. Every minute of your entire life, it is absorbing 20 to 40% of the nutrients that you are feeding it. That's why it's so important to think every time you take a bite of food, what am I feeding my brain?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so on a practical level, we know that you recommend supplementing with broad spectrum vitamins and minerals. Will any over the counter multivitamin product work for that, or do you have more specific recommendations in that regard?
I do, and I wish I could give you a list of 10 or 20 or 30, and even the manufacturers wish there were 10 or 20 or 30. It's hard to get other companies interested in going into this. People often ask me the question, Ari, a little differently, and I just want to mention, they'll say, if I buy one of these one-a-day type of vitamins, which with every passing year, they're adding more and more minerals to them. We still call them one-a-day vitamins. Is that a bad thing? And I always say, no, it's not bad. I mean, any amount of additional nutrients you can get, it's probably a good thing. But you have to look at how they differ from the ones that have been shown to be therapeutically beneficial. Okay. And there has never even been an anecdote that I'm aware of anybody improving their depression or anxiety by taking the over-the-counter formulas.
Mm-hmm.
And when I tell you the two ways they're different, it'll make perfect sense.
Mm-hmm.
One is the dose. The over-the-counter ones are typically about 20% of the RDA and the recommended dietary allowance. And the recommended dietary allowance is based on, you know what it's based on? Have you ever heard this story? I'm quizzing you again, so you can edit it out.
I don't. I was no. I actually I don't. I don't think I know where you're going with that.
Okay, so it was based on what it was believed to take to keep World War II soldiers able to march, basically, and fight. So
Mm-hmm.
it's based on healthy young individuals who did not have a mental disorder and who they were only concerned about physical health, and they were eating well in addition. So it has nothing to do with treating a mental health problem. So not surprisingly, RDA is a very, very low bar. Now, that doesn't mean that any of the broad spectrum formulas that have been studied are megadoses. They are not. But there is this broad area between the RDA, which is quite low, and the tolerable upper level at which you there has occasionally been a report of a toxicity, and all of the broad spectrum formulas fall in that range. So they are a higher dose. They're also in balance. They also have a broader spectrum. So the main thing is the dose and the spectrum. So I mentioned that the kind of 1-a-day type, and I don't mean to be referring to 1-a-day as a brand, the 1-a-day type of vitamins and minerals have increased the number of their minerals, but they're still very few. And the reason is, I think, is that they know they have to start telling people to take more than 1 pill a day, because it's
Yeah.
hard with minerals to get them into a single pill. I
Yep.
always say, think of the Rocky Mountains where I live, minerals are bulky. So anyway, and the broad spectrum formulas are simply based on what is known about brain function. And so there are roughly 15 vitamins and 15 minerals and a few antioxidants too, in very small amounts.
Hmm. Yeah, I know quite a bit about this kind of problem. Because I have my own supplement brand,
That's right.
and
I just remembered that. Yeah.
and I have basically almost all my formulas are not in capsules, actually, for this reason, because one of the things that I do differently from pretty much almost every other brand out there is I'm using real dosages of these ingredients that I'm putting in my formula, whereas most other supplement companies are putting in 1/10 or 1/20 the effective dose. And there is a physical mass problem that you encounter when you are doing what I'm doing, which is, if you want to put in, let's say, to a brain formula, you want to put in 15 different ingredients, all at real clinically effective, the studied doses that have been shown in research to be effective. All of a sudden, you've got 4 grams of powder. It doesn't fit into one capsule or 2 capsules or 3 capsules, So, and I have that problem with all my supplements, including my multivitamin and mineral formula, for the exact reason that you said. So most of them end up being powders, or they end up being at least 5 capsules or so per serving. So yeah, in general, if somebody's saying, hey, take this multivitamin, multi-mineral supplement, and it's easy to take, it's only 1 pill a day, that's pretty much a dead giveaway that it doesn't have adequate amounts of everything that you need if they crammed it into 1 capsule. And I find that many people don't understand this. They don't understand that there is a physical mass. You can't just condense all the stuff into 1 capsule. There's you have to deal with the laws of physics in that regard. So
Yeah. So does anybody ever report improved mental health on any of the formulas you make?
for sure.
So
Oh yeah.
when are you going to
Yeah.
do a study, Ari?
I know.
Because
Well, actually, I would like, believe it or not, I was hoping to pick your brain a bit on that after we record this podcast. I've
okay.
been speaking with a few researcher friends of mine about how I can start to do some studies, hopefully in a way that doesn't cost millions of dollars to conduct. So I would love to pick your brain in that regard.
Excellent. Okay.
Yeah. So as far as, beyond supplements, beyond multivitamin, multi-mineral supplements, what about food? What about nutrition? What are your recommendations there, as far as optimizing mental health? Is there a particular dietary pattern that you're recommending to follow? And what are sort of the core principles of how one should eat to optimize their brain health and mental health?
So the latest research from the US government, it's only a few months old, shows that only 1/3 of the caloric intake of American children has any micronutrients in it.
Whoa.
Okay. They are I'm not sure I got the verb right. Let me say it a different way. 67% of the caloric intake of children under the age of 19 comes from ultra processed chemical packages. So we have an entire generation or two of children who are feeding their brains at about 1/3 of what our ancestors were eating, because they're not eating real food. By the way, if you look at the American data, this is the NHANES survey data. I can send you the reference if you want, from the US government. If you look at the adults, it's a little better. It's 57% instead of 67%, but it's still pretty terrible.
Yeah.
And the results, the data from the UK are about 65%. And the Canadian data, it's a little outdated, but it's over 60%. So it's a Western world problem. We are, I mean, just like the pharmaceutical companies control what goes into our treatments, the food companies control the non-food products which we are eating. They have influenced a whole multiple generations of people that it's okay not to eat real food. So the number one thing to do is what Michael Pollan says, eat real food. He also said not too much and mostly plants. But for the topic we're discussing, eat real food, or what Andy Weil, Dr. Andrew Weil used to call, even before Michael Pollan was on the scene, he said true food. You have to eat true food.
Mm-hmm.
And just doing that, you'll be feeding your brain much better. Yeah.
I know in the book you talk quite a bit about the Mediterranean diet as sort of a good base dietary template to follow. Why not something more trendy like the keto diet?
I'm glad you asked that. So first of all, if you go back and look, I think every time we said Mediterranean, we put Mediterranean style diet, because nobody really knows anymore. What's the Mediterranean diet? Does it require sit down dinners with family and friends? Some people would say yes, red wine, etc. Okay.
Yeah.
The point is that if you look at the graph of the Mediterranean style diet food, it's real food. It's fruits and vegetables and nuts and seeds. It's, depending on if you're a pescatarian or a vegetarian or whatever, you get your protein from different sources. It's whole grains and it's olive oil. And it's learning how to cook with lentils. Beans and legumes are where you will save your money and enrich your diet. So that's why it's the first step toward getting what your brain needs. And as you increase that, you will not have room for those ultra processed chemicals that some people call ultra processed foods, but I refuse to call foods. They're ultra processed non-foods. So why that better than you said it yourself, trendy. There are all kinds of trendy diets that come and go. Ketogenic is fascinating to me because I used to work in an epilepsy unit for a while when I was more in the neurosciences, and the ketogenic, this was 50 years ago, ketogenic diet was all the rage, and I know it's had tremendous effects for some people. But let's step back and remember that we're talking about mental health. And if you're talking about mental health, you're dealing with people who probably aren't feeling very good about themselves, even if they're not outright depressed. The last thing they need is a failure experience. And some of these diets, we don't call them trendy diets. I think in the book, we call them restrictive diets. They're hard to follow. Even a gluten-free diet is hard to follow. And some people don't need a gluten-free diet. So we don't say you shouldn't do any of those, but we're just saying, don't make it your first step. First, eat real food. See how much better you can get on that. And then if you decide maybe, you really do think you might be gluten sensitive, go on a gluten-free diet. If you think you really want to try intermittent fasting, try it. But first, get rid of the rubbish. That's my philosophy.
Are there any specific foods or supplements beyond broad spectrum nutrient supplementation, like things that you would put in the category of superfood, super herbs, super supplements of various kinds? Anything that has jumped out to you that has really impressed you as far as its ability to improve brain health and mental health?
Actually, the simple answer is no. I mean, certainly omega-3 fatty acids are important for building and maintaining our cell walls. And that's true throughout our brain and body. There are herbs like turmeric that are very well supported for arthritis, kinds of pains, inflammatory things, but I don't think there's any evidence of it being particularly relevant for brain health. So for brain health, if we just stick to mental health, I would just say, eat real food and get rid of the rubbish. don't try a restrictive diet first because you might find it too hard and you'll feel like a failure, and this is not the way to go. You want to feel good about yourself. Do all the other things, exercise, meditation, family support, etc. And you can transform. I know people transform their lives doing that, even without any kind of supplementation.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Kaplan, I've really enjoyed this. If you were going to leave people with sort of your top 2 or top 3 big takeaways that, or key insights from all of your work, what would those 2 or 3 things be?
Okay. So hard to boil your whole life down this way, Ari. Eat real food and get rid of the rubbish. That's number 1. Pay attention to learn how nutrients work in your brain so that you know why. We get asked a lot, why did we write a book on nutrition? There's so many nutrition books out there, and there are even a few on mental health or brain health. And I call them the shake their finger in your face books because they say, eat this, eat that. And I don't think that changes anybody's behavior. So learn why what you put in your mouth matters. And that's why we wrote our book, was to explain that. We teach the triage theory, which I don't have time to go into here. We teach about the brain pathways. So learn why and be good to yourself. Don't become a fanatic. I always say life is not worth living if I can't have an occasional chocolate chip cookie.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kaplan. I've really, really enjoyed this. Thank you for coming on the show and sharing your wisdom with my audience. To everybody listening, I want to strongly recommend you go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble or wherever you buy books and get Dr. Kaplan's book, Better Brain. And Dr. Kaplan, is there anywhere that you'd like to direct people to follow your work or get in touch with you or anything like that?
Yeah, I appreciate your asking that, Ari. You can find everything, including the picture of the purple cauliflower, so that you get the correct book, on my own website. And the only thing you have to know is my middle initial, which is J. So it's BonnieJKaplan.com. You can contact me there. All the emails come directly to me or my co-author, Julia Ruckledge. And there are a lot of videos, and there's a link to Julia's TEDx talk, which has been seen several million times. So a lot of good resources there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on again. I really, really enjoyed this.
Thank you, Ari.
Hey there, this is Ari again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, if you found it valuable, please share it with your friends, share it with your family, help me get the word out there. Also, if you're on YouTube, make sure to hit the subscribe button and hit that little bell to get notifications every time we release a new video or new episode of the podcast. And if you're listening to this, make sure to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or on your favorite podcast app. Thanks so much for supporting my work at The Energy Blueprint. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I will see you in the next one.